Episode 10, The Dacian Wars, 100 to 109 AD. Hello and welcome to a new century of 202 decades. It's been a minute since our last decade episode, so let's recap a little. Last time, the reign of Domitian came to an end with his assassination. Many in the Senate had been eager to see him dead, but it was members of his own household who finally killed the emperor. In Domitian's place, the Senate appointed Nerva as Princeps. He was presented as a strong contrast to Domitian, a return to republicanism after 15 years of Domitian's autocracy. But Nerva had more connections with the old regime than our sources admit. Nerva had been in Domitian's inner circle, close enough to warn him of a governor's rebellion in 89. As thanks, Domitian made Nerva consul with him in 90. Despite his ties to the old regime, the assassination of Domitian broke the relationship between the military and the princeps. Nerva tried to appease the Praetorians, giving them large cash donatives, which worked for a while. The army was more distant and less threatening at the moment, but they refused to acknowledge him. After only a year, the Praetorians stormed the imperial palace and cornered Nerva at the point of a sword. They demanded he execute the assassins of Domitian. Reluctantly, Nerva complied. This event either caused him to reconsider his choice of heir, or the Praetorians gave him the name they preferred. He had been considering adopting Maternus, the governor of Syria, but after the Praetorians violated his office and personal security, he instead chose Trajan, who was popular with the army. Trajan too had been involved in suppressing the revolt against Domitian in 89. He's yet another example of continuity passed off as a break from the Flavians. Trajan, at the time of his sudden adoption, was governor of Germania Superior, the province that today covers northeast France and western Germany on the left bank of the Rhine River. Just a few months later, word arrived that Nerva was dead. Trajan was emperor now. His next actions demonstrate his self-assuredness. Instead of racing for Rome to secure the Senate and the people's approval, he stayed along the frontier. Through all of the year 98, Trajan delayed his coming to Rome. Instead, he visited the armies guarding the Rhine, in his province and nearby downstream in Germania Inferior. Next, he traveled southeast to inspect and meet with the legions guarding the Danube. It's here that he began to dream of conquest. Word of the riches across the river in Dacia circulated among his troops. What better way to earn their undying admiration than reversing the humiliations the Romans had faced against the Dacians under Domitian? And looting the legendary treasures of Dacia would certainly help to make his legions very, very happy. In 99, he finally entered Rome. His stay in the capital would be short. Marcus Ulpius Traianus was not content to rest in comfort while there were enemies yet unconquered. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, Unbowed, Unbroken. Part 2, Dacia, Round 2. Part 3, Arabia Petraea. Part 4, Trajan in Rome. Part 5, Sources, Columns. Part 1, Unbowed, Unbroken. Trajan's first entry into Rome as emperor was understated. Domitian had presented himself almost as a king, ignoring the senators as mere distraction. Trajan was a more subtle politician. He knew that after living through Domitian's term, the Senate was eager to be seen as equals. From the speech of Pliny the Younger, who we will hear much more from next time, we can see the Senate's appreciation of this humility. Trajan had secured the goodwill of the army, and now the Senate was falling in line. Trajan would need all of the support he could get, because even at this early point in his reign, he knew he would be away from Rome for an extended period of time. He needed stability at home. But Trajan also knew that the purpose of his absence would only strengthen his support among the army, the Senate, and the people. Trajan was going to war with Dacia. What provoked this war is a bit of a debate. The traditional view, listed by Cassius Dio, is that Trajan began the war to avenge the defeats Domitian suffered. Only a fragile peace held between Rome and Dacia, one that was unfavorable to Rome. Rome had to essentially pay tribute to Dacia and provided them with builders to construct defenses for their northern border. The Dacian king, Decebalus, instead built defenses in the south to protect him from the Romans. These preparations for a future conflict weren't one-sided, though. Domitian himself had relocated 2 cavalry units and 2 legions to Moesia to protect against future Dacian incursions. At the time of Domitian's death, 9 legions protected the Danube frontier. After Trajan became emperor, when he visited the Danube legions in 98, he immediately got to work readying an invasion. He had a fortified pontoon bridge constructed across the river, built a series of forts to house the increased numbers of soldiers who would soon be in Moesia, readied a river fleet in the Danube, and built canals along rough sections in the river. Planning was Trajan's greatest strategy. Having served as governor of Germania Superior and Pannonia prior to becoming emperor, Trajan was familiar with the Dacians, and he knew they were no ordinary barbarians. They were better armed and armored than the Germans or than the Gauls had been in Caesar's day. These Dacians could afford to be well equipped because of massive gold reserves. Until Decebalus, these tribes, while dangerous, were not coordinated. They had been a mere nuisance. Now that they were united under Decebalus, they posed a real, unified threat to Rome. So again, the traditional view is that Trajan began his war as revenge. The alternative view, which I think makes more sense, is that Trajan from the start planned a war of conquest over Dacia, both to neutralize it as a threat and, most importantly, to seize its vast gold reserves. In 101 AD, Trajan requested approval from the Senate for the invasion of Dacia. He didn't have to do this, but it fit well with his policy of including the Senate whenever possible. The flattered Senate overwhelmingly approved his request. Taking with him 2 new legions, one named Traianus, the other Ulpia after his family name, Trajan marched up eastern Italy and arrived at Viminacium, a major military camp in Moesia on the Danube, in what's now the country of Serbia. Meeting Trajan there was Hadrian, Trajan's nephew, and the Praetorian prefect, Livianus, who led a Praetorian cohort. In March of 101, Trajan crossed a wooden bridge built by his chief architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, and entered Dacia from the west. At the same time, it seems Livianus and his Praetorians led an army into Dacia from the southwest. Decebalus quickly made his own moves. He contacted his allies, a Sarmatian tribe to his east called the Roxolani, and implemented his defensive network. Dacia was a difficult country to invade. The heartland of Dacia and the capital of Sarmizegetusa was surrounded by steep mountains, the southern swing of the Carpathians. This terrain allowed Decebalus to fortify narrow passes and engage the Romans using guerrilla tactics. Older sources claim Decebalus was able to rally 200,000 warriors, but this seems like a gross overestimate. His choice to employ defensive and guerrilla strategies points to a much smaller force, one that could only fight the legions head-on if conditions were perfect. Trajan did his best not to give the Dacians any perfect conditions. He was always a skilled and patient planner. Trajan had learned from the lessons of Domitian's war, when the Roman general Fuscus had raced into Dacia and then was ambushed and eliminated. Trajan's army moved slowly and carefully, relying heavily on scouts. They methodically cleared the low-lying areas throughout the spring and then entered the hill country, Trajan from the west, Livianus from the south. Both the Romans and the Dacians knew where the key point of conflict was going to occur, at a fortified pass through the mountains called Petraea, not far from the Dacian capital. It was here that Fuscus had been ambushed in 86, and it was here in 88 that Domitian's new army had beaten the Dacians in a decisive battle. The columns of Trajan and Livianus reunited, and together they captured a significant Dacian town called Tepiscum, which controlled east-west trade routes through the mountains. Then, together, as summer approached its end, they marched into the pass. Waiting for them at the choke point of Petraea were Decebalus and his army. It was only here that the Dacian king felt confident the odds were in his favor. And he had to fight here. His capital was just a few miles away. So the Dacians stood and gave battle. Very few details of the fight can be reported for certain. Apparently, the fighting was much tougher than even Trajan had expected, and the Romans suffered heavy casualties. This is purely a guess, but I expect either Dacian fortifications or trickery made the battle especially deadly for the Romans. During a long day of fighting, the battle was a stalemate until, as a storm blew in, Decebalus ordered his army to perform a tactical retreat. They pulled back and abandoned the pass. So Trajan immediately pressed his advantage, marched to Sarmizegetusa, and put the city to siege, right? Well, no. Again, the minor victory had been costly. Decebalus and most of his army survived, and there was still a line of forts between Trajan and the capital. It was only September, but Trajan must have known he could not take the city before the winter came. So, instead of assaulting the capital, Trajan pulled back his forces and waited for spring. Warfare rarely occurred during the winter in the ancient world. Trajan spent the winter resting his soldiers and securing his supply lines. Decebalus, on the other hand, knew he was in a precarious position. He was outnumbered and his capital lay vulnerable. So despite the ice and snow, Decebalus ordered a counterattack, hoping to open a new front and divide Roman forces. He signaled to his allies, the Roxolani horsemen, and a Celtic Germanic Scythian people called the Bastarnae, that it was time to strike. These two tribes joined a Dacian army in the east of Dacia, near the Black Sea. Together they crossed the frozen Danube River. The weather, though, was against them. It was on the warmer side, and a significant number of the army fell through the ice into the river and drowned. Decebalus's counterpunch had gotten off to a miserable start. The demoralized remnants of his army headed west. Their speed increased thanks to the Roman roads on this side of the Danube. They made it far enough to threaten the Roman military camp at Nicopolis in Moesia. Trajan sent an army and a skirmish broke out as the two sides came into contact. The Dacians and their allies were driven back east, wounded but still strong enough to raid the towns they passed. The Roman army followed, gained reinforcements as they went, and finally they cornered the Dacians, Roxolani, and Bastarnae at a site called Adamclisi, near the Danube River and just 35 miles from the Black Sea. The battle was a decisive Roman victory, but again, the Romans suffered heavily too. The few survivors among the Dacians and their allies fled back across the Danube. Maximus, the governor of Lower Moesia, received credit for this victory. Somehow in all of this, he was able to capture the sister of Decebalus. It's not clear to me when or how he was able to capture her, but she proved a useful bargaining token. With the arrival of spring, Trajan readied his men for a second campaign. They advanced along the two routes they had secured the prior year, and just past Petraea, they again defeated a Dacian army. Roman armies now approached Sarmizegetusa from three sides. Only a few forts protected the capital. Decebalus now offered his surrender, but the Romans came back and demanded it be unconditional. Decebalus returned no response, and the Romans assaulted and took these last forts. Seeing the Romans' advance was unstoppable, the Dacian king offered his surrender to spare Sarmizegetusa from being besieged. The Dacian ambassadors came to Trajan's tent and prostrated themselves at his feet. This time, with another winter approaching, Trajan was feeling generous. A treaty was signed that more than reversed the shame brought by Domitian's treaty. The Dacians agreed to allow Roman garrisons in their country, one even in Sarmizegetusa. They agreed to hand over all weapons and war machines, return all deserters and prisoners, destroy several bastions near their capital, renounce all independent foreign policy, and forfeit a significant chunk of land to the Romans. Dacia was now merely a territory of Rome governed by the local king, a client kingdom. As peace settled in, the Romans began to supply their new client kingdom with resources to defend themselves from the north and east. The Dacians were clear that they had begun to experience pressure from migrating tribes coming from this direction. Perhaps you recognize this trickle as the first movement in a torrent of migration that will grow in later centuries. The Dacians and their new Roman benefactors were trying to stop that flood. Ostensibly. What the defensive resources were actually used for is another story. As Trajan returned to Rome, he brought with him the legionary eagle lost to the Dacians in 86. With this trophy of his victory, he marched through the Via Sacra before the crowds in a well-earned triumph. Part 2. Dacia, Round 2. Trajan spent the next few years in Rome. Rather than getting into all that he did there, we're going to stay on topic and see how the Dacian Wars concluded. Since the Treaty of 102, peace had held between Rome and its new Dacian subjects. Roman colonists had begun to settle the new territory taken from the Dacians. An official named Pompeius Longinus was charged with governing the new territory. On the surface, all seemed to be going well, and the Dacians showed submission to their new masters. Trajan didn't trust them, though. He made plans with his architect Apollodorus of Damascus, and a stone-piered bridge was constructed across the Danube River from 103 to 105. This would come to be called Trajan's Bridge. It held the record for being the longest arched bridge in the world for over 1,000 years. It was 1,135 meters long, almost 3/4 of a mile, and 15 meters wide. Each end was guarded by a stone gatehouse. This bridge ensured that if the Dacians made trouble, the legions could easily cross into Dacia. The completion of the bridge in 105 was timely. Secretly, Decebalus had begun to rebuild his armies and form alliances with tribes hostile to Rome. This itself was a breach of the treaties, for the Dacians' foreign policy was supposed to be the same as Rome's. But Decebalus went further and incited these tribes to attack the Romans. Among them were some tribes of Dacians who Decebalus claimed were outside of his control. Essentially, he had started a proxy war. Although long suspicious, Trajan seems to have been taken off guard by the betrayal of Decebalus. A less confident emperor would have treated Decebalus like a misbehaving ally and brought him to the table to negotiate an end to the Dacian king's instigations. If Decebalus expected Trajan to behave like this, to negotiate, it was to his fault. Trajan reacted harshly but wisely. This was now the third strike against Decebalus, and Trajan knew there could never be peace while Decebalus lived. So in 105, Trajan gathered his legions, his auxiliaries, and the Praetorians, and set off once again toward the Danube. Trajan and his armies crossed into Dacia, marching over the newly finished bridge. As the legions moved north into the hills, they were forced to skirmish several times with the Dacians and suffered higher than hoped for casualties. Decebalus was again relying on guerrilla tactics to slow the Romans. The legions had to methodically clear the forts which had just been retaken by the Dacians. Little progress was made in the campaign of 105. Meanwhile, Decebalus was leading attacks on eastern Moesia, closer to the Black Sea. As these attacks took place, he offered to meet with Pompeius Longinus, the governor of the territory newly taken from the Dacians. Longinus agreed to meet, but when he reached the Dacian camp, he was captured and taken as captive. Decebalus planned to use him as a bargaining chip. A letter was sent to Trajan offering to trade Longinus for the territory taken from Dacia. This action, to me, points to Decebalus not realizing how serious Trajan was taking this campaign. Decebalus was trying to negotiate for lost territory. Trajan was committed to eliminating the Dacian kingdom. To the letter, Trajan returned an ambiguous reply. While Decebalus pondered how to use his captive to his advantage, the captive took the initiative to take himself off the chessboard. Longinus secretly secured a supply of poison and killed himself, a noble action to allow Trajan to act freely. Trajan cautiously continued to push north with his army, skirmishing, securing fortresses and passes. As the Romans again neared Sarmizegetusa, Decebalus must have come to his senses. If this second war was a chess game, Decebalus had been focusing on secondary pieces. Now, finally, he awoke and aimed for the king. We don't have details here, but an assassination attempt was made on Trajan at the hands of Roman deserters who had switched over to the side of the Dacians. Trajan survived these attempts. An assault by the Dacians was made against the Roman defenses near where Trajan's army had crossed, but it was well defended and the attackers were pushed away. Trajan returned across the river as winter fell. Here he called in his allied tribes, the Quadi, the Iazyges, and the Marcomanni. He feared that they might be swayed to join with the coalition of Decebalus. But whatever Trajan said or offered worked. He secured their support for the final campaign. When spring of 106 arrived, his army crossed the river and headed north one last time. Progress was much quicker than it had been during the war a few years earlier. They passed through the narrow passes of the hill country and brushed aside Dacian resistance. The Roman army now closed on the forts around the capital. Fewer of them now stood. Many had been destroyed during or following the previous war. The remaining forts were captured one by one. By midsummer, Trajan put Sarmizegetusa under siege. We can't give a play-by-play of the siege, but we know it was long and difficult. The Dacians sallied from the city several times and inflicted heavy casualties before being forced back in. Booby traps claimed the lives of many Romans, and on the walls of the city were mounted many skulls of the Roman dead next to the dragon banners of the Dacians. In return, the Romans cut the water lines flowing into the city. Siege engines, catapults, and ballistas battered the walls. The legions built a platform to mount the walls. As the siege dragged on, the outcome became obvious to the defenders, and the Dacians acted to deny some glory of victory from the Romans. Fires were started in the city. Many of the Dacian nobility committed suicide to avoid being taken as prisoner. With much of the leadership dead, the city surrendered. As the Romans moved in, it became clear that Decebalus had fled. As parties went out to find the Dacian king, the legions tore down the walls and citadel of the city. Decebalus had fled to the north, into remote regions of the Carpathian Mountains. Here he rallied the Dacian nobles and continued the fight, but he was hotly pursued by a Roman detachment, and in the autumn of 106 he was cornered. He would not be taken back and marched in chains before the crowds in Rome. Before he could be captured, he committed suicide. With Decebalus dead and his capital destroyed, the legions fanned out across Dacia and brought an end to resistance. The Dacian Wars were at an end. There was no treaty this time. The south of the Dacian kingdom was totally absorbed into the Roman Empire. A new Roman province was established with its capital named after the conqueror Trajan, Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa. Roman colonists were brought in from Pannonia, and 3 legions were stationed in the province. Assimilation moved forward. The rewards of conquest quickly made themselves apparent. First, there were the gold mines. Hugely productive mines were put to work with slave and hired labor, and they soon began to pump out precious metals. Second were the riches of the Dacian king. Before the old Dacian capital had been assaulted, The treasures of the city had been hidden in a river. Not long after the war ended, a Dacian seeking favor from his new masters betrayed the location. The hoard was massive. Over 135 metric tons of gold and over 330 metric tons of silver. And that was just one of many collections. The mines and the treasures of Dacia pumped money into the Roman treasury. Trajan, who may have been aiming for this monetary capture all along, soon put these new resources to work. On May 26 of 107 AD, Trajan returned for a tremendous triumph in Rome. The celebrations were extravagant, the parade shining with captured gold. These celebrations lasted for 123 days. Trajan had brought great glory to Rome. Like Drusus being acclaimed Germanicus for his victories in Germania, and like Claudius being acclaimed Britannicus when he captured Britannia, Trajan was hailed as Dacicus. The Dacian Wars had come to an end, bringing with them huge implications for Rome and Dacia itself. First was population change. The wars had been devastating to the Dacian population. Tens of thousands had died fighting the Romans. More were carted off as slaves after the war. An analysis of names in Dacia a few decades after the war points to more than 3/4 having Latin names and less than 1/4 having Dacian names. The legacy of the demographic and cultural change can still be seen on your world map. What's the name of the country that exists where Dacia once was? Romania, the land of the Romans. And the language of this country is a descendant of Latin, an eastern cousin of French, Italian, and Spanish. While the Dacian tribes were eliminated or thoroughly assimilated in the new province, several Dacian tribes in the north of what was Decebalus' kingdom remained outside of the Roman province. These were considered the Free Dacians, and they would continue to raid the Roman province from their remote homes in the Carpathians. They were never again united though, and it's likely they assimilated in later centuries with the migrating Germans or other peoples. For the Romans, the province was a huge boon to their finances. I've mentioned a few times recently the trouble Rome was facing with their monetary supply. A large outflow of coins was limiting the emperor's ability to spend and fund the armies. To pay for building projects and the armies, emperors since Nero had to resort to devaluing the coinage, cutting back on the percent of precious metals in each coin. This led to rising prices across the empire. Domitian had added back some percent of precious metals, which slowed inflation some. Trajan, to fund his Dacian wars, had resorted to devaluing once again, though. Now, with a steady stream of Dacian gold flowing into the imperial coffers, Trajan could spend without devaluing. We'll see how he used the money domestically later in this episode, and in the next episode, we'll see how this ability to fund large military campaigns would play out. Lastly, if you get the chance, take a look at the limits of the Roman Empire in 117 AD. You can ignore the territory Trajan will conquer next decade for now. I want you to look at the new Dacian province in the top right side of the map. It protrudes north of the Danube with non-Roman held lands on 3 sides. Dacia was a lucrative conquest, but it was a clear departure from Augustus' philosophy of sticking to natural borders. Dacia was vulnerable, both from the Germanic north and from the steppes to the east. Will the Romans be able to defend it from migrating peoples? We shall see. Part 3. The Capture of Nabatea. Before we return with Trajan to Rome, I don't want to miss an often overlooked aside. In 106 AD, at the same time the Romans were concluding the conquest of Dacia, the kingdom of Nabatea was added to the empire. Who were the Nabateans? Well, you've probably heard of Petra, the city in the south of modern Jordan carved into the rose sandstone. You know, the place where Indiana Jones and his father find the Holy Grail? Besides being the creators of Petra, the Nabateans were an Arab people from northern Arabia and southern Levant. Their kingdom arose in the 4th century BC around cities in a trading network that stretched across the desert of Arabia and Syria. Like their neighbors in Judea, Aramaic was their primary language. They vacillated between being allies and rivals of the Judean state. Chaos in this relationship helped to invite the Romans to gain control of Judea in the 60s BC. The Nabateans, though more remote and in the desert, would remain independent for the next century and a half. They warred with Judea during the reign of Herod the Great, but as Rome annexed Egypt and Judea, they became increasingly surrounded by the Romans. At some point during the 1st century, they became a client kingdom, formally independent but with certain obligations to the Romans. Petra was their capital, and it was truly an amazing city, hidden in a wadi in the Negev desert. To enter the city, you pass through the Sik, a winding gorge between tall rock walls, almost a mile long. As you near the end, through the sliver of opening, the most iconic building in Petra comes into view. But it was much more than this single building carved into stone. Up to 30,000 people lived here, and the city was full of houses, temples, warehouses, a theater, gardens, and pools. The management of water here is noteworthy. They had a complex system of cisterns, conduits, dams, and clay pipes, which enabled them to sustain a population in the desert. Water was the key to their survival. It allowed Petra to be a refuge in the desert crossing. The absence of water around it kept it safe from invaders. In 106 AD, the last king of the Nabateans, Rabel II, died. The governor of Syria, Cornelius Palma, brought an army from Syria and met up with an army from Egypt. Again, we have no details of the standoff that took place, or how the Romans moved 2 armies through the dry deserts. But by the end of 107, Roman soldiers were garrisoned in Petra and Basra, the 2 largest Nabatean cities. The kingdom was transformed into a new province, Arabia Petraea. A new road, the Via Traiana Nova, was built linking Basra, which is in the south of modern Syria, to the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba. Trade goods were unloaded from ships here, arriving from India, hauled overland to the northwest toward Petra, and then to the Mediterranean port of Gaza, or straight north through Basra and then on to Damascus or Antioch. No longer would Roman merchants have to pay steep tariffs to Nabatean merchants. This annexation was another policy action to lower the costs and impacts of importing luxury goods from the east. The Romans also used Arabia Petraea to recruit new auxiliary units from the Arabs of the Negev. This new acquisition, a toehold in the desert, strengthened the trade and cultural bonds of Arabia with the Mediterranean world, which will have large implications a few centuries down the road. More immediately, though small in size and population, the Nabatean conquest is a foretaste for the next decade. Part 4. Trajan in Rome. We've seen Trajan the conqueror, but how was Trajan the administrator? Let's start with his use of power. With his abandoning of the Senate, Domitian had built up his court into a great web of bureaucracy, with himself at the center. Trajan reduced the size of this court, trimming down the large executive system. He believed in lean, efficient governing. The Senate remained ceremonial, but at least Trajan allowed them to play their part in the ceremony. Will Durant puts it like this: he asked the Senate's opinion on all matters of moment, and discovered that he might wield nearly absolute power if he never used absolute speech. The Senate was willing to let him rule if he would observe the forms that maintained its dignity and prestige. A little hyperbole, but it gets to the heart of Trajan's strategy and its results. Trajan gave the Senate a little lip service, humility, and honor, and they had his back. Trajan had rediscovered the secret that had allowed Augustus to become princeps in the first place, more than a century before. A little deference to the Senate goes a long way. Trajan did select a few individual senators to serve in his administration. His expectations of them were high. He set an example for meticulousness and fairness which his governors and other appointees were expected to follow. And as we'll see in the next decade, when we get into the correspondences of Pliny the Younger and Trajan, he believed in letting these provincial governors figure out everyday policy for themselves. Trajan may have been born outside of Italy, but he understood himself and his empire as Roman above all else. He understood the central position of Italy, and he worked to better it. Trajan continued and expanded the alimenta program, first begun under Nerva. This feeding fund was a cash payment of a dozen or so sesterces to the poorest families each month for each child they had. The charity was small. It cost about 20 sesterces per month to raise a child, but it certainly took pressure off of poor families. On top of the alimenta, he allowed children to receive the grain dole on top of their parents' allotment. At this time, the alimenta only extended to children in Italy, as the goal was to raise the birth rate there, an unsolved concern since Augustus. Trajan also required senators to invest a third of their capital into Italian real estate. The Senate had become increasingly provincial. By Trajan's time, only about 30 names from the old Republican days were still found in the Senate rolls. Trajan's consuls came from across the empire: a Greek from Asia Minor, a Moor from North Africa, a Judean descendant of Herod the Great, and a grandson of an Athenian archon. But despite their wide origins, he required them to call Rome home. They were to be Roman first. This measure led to sharp rises in land prices in Italy, especially nearer to Rome. When this pushed out some smaller landowners, Trajan offered them state-backed loans at low interest rates. These loans, along with larger mandatory loans to large landowners, paid for the alimenta. They also funded improvements in agriculture near Rome, which might have done a little to help feed the capital. Not with bulk goods like grains, but at least with olive oil, meat, and wine. Trajan employed every bit as much planning to domestic projects as to military ones. He tapped his chief architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, the one who had engineered the Great Bridge across the Danube, to build a grand forum in the heart of Rome. This was to be the largest and last of the forums built by the early emperors. It was so large that the Quirinal Hill had to be excavated and cut back 40 meters to keep the ground level. Trajan's forum included an open piazza 300 by 185 meters in size, flanked by colonnades on its longer sides. Beyond one shorter side lay the Forum of Augustus. On the other shorter side was a new Basilica Ulpia, a large public building which, despite its name, was not a religious building, but a house for the administration of justice and where the emperor governed from. Continuing through the basilica from the piazza, you would enter a small square courtyard with a library on either side. In the center of the courtyard, rising 35 meters into the sky above you, was Trajan's column. This column was 3.7 meters in diameter, with a narrow spiral staircase inside, allowing access to the top. On its face are carved in an upward spiral intricate scenes from Trajan's conquest of Dacia. This column still stands in Rome, but today it is topped with a bronze statue of St. Peter. Going back into the main open piazza, if you looked to the east toward the Quirinal Hill, you would find a large marketplace, almost like a modern shopping mall, carved in 3 levels against the hill. Apollodorus had constructed this too, incorporating 150 shops into the market. Trajan's public works also included constructions to make it easier for these shops in Rome to obtain their wares. In the 40s AD, Claudius had begun improvements to the harbor at Ostia, Rome's main port, to allow the grain fleets to safely unload their huge cargoes at the mouth of the Tiber, rather than having to dock at a harbor near Naples and be carried overland to Rome. Claudius's construction had added 2 breakwaters, or piers, to create a larger harbor. While the ships were now more sheltered, there were still shortcomings. Tacitus says that in 62, several grain ships were sunk in Claudius's harbor during a storm. Trajan had a new harbor constructed, farther inland from the harbor of Claudius. It was hexagonal in shape and better protected ships. Though smaller than the harbor of Claudius, it was still very big, almost a half-mile across. It was surrounded by warehouses for the transferring and storing of goods. Canals linked the new harbor to the Tiber. From here, barges would haul goods upstream to Rome. The remains of Trajan's harbor can still be seen today. If you pull up Google Maps and find Leonardo da Vinci Airport southwest of Rome, just south of the airport, you will see a hexagon-shaped body of water called Lago Traiano. If you tuned in to the last episode, you heard about the aqueducts, courtesy of Frontinus, the curator of Rome's water supply, who worked under Nerva and Trajan. Frontinus, in his assessment of the aqueducts he presented to the emperor, listed 9 aqueducts and their output. Well, in 109, his job got a little more complicated with the construction of a new aqueduct, the Aqua Traiana. Unfortunately, we know less about the aqueducts built after Frontinus' document was published, so we can't comment on the exact output of the one commissioned by Trajan. We do know that its opening in 109 coincided with the Naumachia, a mock naval battle that was always a popular spectacle. And 2 days later, the Baths of Trajan were opened, a large bathing and leisure complex on the Oppian Hill. Add up all of these public works, not to mention his conquests, and it's easy to see why he was beloved. Trajan is credited for being careful with expenditures, which seems hard to believe if you've listened to this long list of constructions and campaigns. But he kept a balanced budget despite his immense expenditures. We have to give him credit for that. He had solved Rome's money shortages through conquest and then put that money into improving the empire. Part 5. Sources, Columns. To conclude this episode, I want to talk for a moment about our sources for this period, or the lack thereof. You may have noticed I had to repeatedly be a bit vague on details when it came to the Dacian Wars or the annexation of Nabatea. Well, that's because our source material for the period of Trajan's reign is very limited. Unlike the reigns of previous emperors, when we had several ancient sources, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and briefly Plutarch, during Trajan's reign, our sources drop off, and we are left with Cassius Dio alone. And as I pointed out in a past episode, after Claudius's reign, all we have of Dio is a summary written by a Byzantine monk in the 11th century. For example, here's what we have from Cassius Dio on the conquest of Nabatea. About this time, Palma, the governor of Syria, subdued the part of Arabia around Petra and made it subject to the Romans. That's not a lot of textual information to go on to cover the best of emperors. Tacitus and Suetonius both lived during Trajan's reign, but prudently stopped their histories before reaching him. Trajan himself wrote a history of his Dacian wars, but wouldn't you know it, that's been lost too. So we're left with Cassius Dio, coins, engravings, and archaeology. The coins printed in Trajan's reign are helpful in working out what the imperial administration wanted the people to think of their leaders. When Trajan distributed coins to the citizens after his Dacian conquests, the coins said liberalitas, advertising his generosity. After the Nabatean kingdom was annexed, coins were printed saying Arabia adquista, Arabia acquired. And after the Senate voted him the title Optimus in 105, coins were printed saying Optimus Princeps, the best of Princeps. Key to our understanding of the Dacian Wars is Trajan's column. I described it briefly in the last section, but it features 155 scenes carved in a spiral relief into the marble. The detail of the scenes is impressive, and much of our knowledge of the look of a Roman campaign and of the Dacians come from these reliefs. We get insight into Roman arms and armor, siege weapons, supply trains, non-combatants, forts, camps, and construction. While very detailed and with clear messages about what occurred, there's debate on how literal we should take the images. They seem to emphasize the orderliness of the conquest with few scenes of battle. Perhaps they were trying to sell the image of a civilized campaign to the genteel sensibilities of urban Rome. The reality was probably much more brutal. But again, we frequently have to speculate on finer details. And that, dear listener, is a problem we will continue to face as we move forward. We aren't done with Trajan just yet. Next time, Trajan will pick up his sword one more time and follow Alexander the Great into Persia. Thanks for listening. Please leave a rating and a review if you're enjoying this series. I'll see you next time.